Oh, and welcome everyone to this week's episode of Container Bytes. I'm Julia Frohwein, here with our resident freight expert, Judah Levine, ready to kick off another 10-minute session on all things freight. Judah, how are you doing today?
Good.
Yeah, doing all right. Yeah, getting into it now, week 2.
A pro. You're a pro already.
We'll see how it goes. All right, let's talk freight. So again, this week we saw more volatility in the Strait of Hormuz. What has the latest stopping and starting meant for container freight?
Yeah, so early this week, President Trump announced in the U.S. launched what they call Project Freedom, which is basically a new U.S.-led effort to have vessels transit basically out of the Strait of Hormuz, but through the Strait of Hormuz. And earlier in the week, the U.S. supported 2 U.S.-flagged vessels, supported in various ways, but including Navy vessels presence and escorted them out of the strait. But this entailed Iranian attacks on those vessels, both on the commercial vessels and on the Navy vessels. And the U.S. responded, sinking some of the Iranian kind of attack speedboats. And as part of this event or context, Iran also restarted missile and drone attacks on the UAE. So all of these are really escalations in terms of the level of military back and forth that we've seen since the ceasefire went in place, which was about a month ago. But then quickly, by Tuesday, the U.S. said that they were suspending this operation. President Trump says it's because there is now more progress in negotiations. So there was a lot of drama, but it was kind of short-lived. Overall, even if it had continued for the freight markets, if it's not a full opening, then container vessels are most likely not going to be going through. But the larger issue for the freight markets is the price of oil and therefore the price of fuel. And it would probably be unlikely that these types of efforts, without something much, much bigger, would be possible to kind of really restore oil flows through the strait. So far, it's kind of been more of the same.
Okay, so what does that mean for freight rates? Any changes there?
Yeah, so again, the big issue for freight rates is the price of oil and therefore the price of bunker fuel. And that's putting cost pressure on carriers in terms of those higher bunker prices. Although so far there really are very few instances of actual fuel shortages. But of course, the longer the stretch is on, the higher that risk is. But we're also in a period of ocean, supply and demand dynamic that make it difficult for carriers to push rates up very high. So first of all, in terms of demand, we're in that slow season between after Lunar New Year and before peak season. And so demand is typically low during this stretch, and it's low now. And of course, we also have high capacity levels like we've seen fleet growth over the last few years. So we're seeing carriers having some difficulty in pushing those costs to shippers, or at least in increasing rates very significantly, although there's different behavior on different levels. So on the Transpacific, last week rates ticked up 2% to the West Coast and 10% to the East Coast. But overall, since the start of the war, rates are up $1,000 per container for both lanes, which is more or less a 50% gain for both of these. And that's significant. And it's also significant that this is kind of stuck, that we haven't seen backsliding on these lanes. But the actual rate level is not much higher than we had in the lead up to the New Year, which was a high demand period, even though now we're in a low demand period. So it is significant. And carriers seem to be passing on costs on these lanes, but we're not seeing very, very high levels, spiking levels like we saw in some of the other disruptions, which were much more kind of actual container supply impact or demand impacts. For Asia, Europe, on the other hand, we're seeing rates that are really about back or just below levels they were before the war. So we saw rates increase in the first few weeks and kind of stay relatively elevated, but have come down really across through April. And now Asia Mediterranean rates are slightly below where they were before the war. To North Europe, they're about only $100 per container high. So kind of less success on this lanes. But again, if we're in a low demand period, we didn't see rates continue to fall. They stayed, where they were just kind of posted in the New Year. So there's probably some higher costs being pushed through and passed on, but not to the same extent that we saw on Transpacific.
Okay, so you touched on this earlier about fuel and fuel costs. What would you say is the economic impacts from these higher energy costs, and any concerns these could have ramifications on freight?
Yeah, so far we're not seeing kind of direct impacts on consumer behavior in any of the major importing markets. There are some initial signs that manufacturing activity or new orders are starting to slow in some of the Far East countries, especially I think in places like Vietnam. So that is a factor. So if we're seeing slowing demand for manufacturing, that's going to be a indication of what imports are thinking in terms of consumer demand. But these places are also facing higher costs, higher input costs, and that might be why some of that manufacturing is slowing. And also just supply availability. Some of the inputs aren't available because they're typically come through the Strait of Hormuz, and so that is an impact. In terms of consumer spending, we haven't seen that big a shift yet, and consumer spending has kind of kept up in the U.S., although there are kind of shifts or reports of shifts in how consumers are spending and what types of goods because of just higher prices overall, which are energy costs are likely to impact that further. So that's really a question mark of what this will mean for peak season in terms of consumer demand or in terms of importer expectations of what consumer demand is going to be during the big shopping events.
And okay, moving to air cargo now. As we've seen, there's been some renewed attacks on the UAE this week. Has that impacted operations there? And what's the recent volatility meant for air cargo in general?
Right. So as we said, part of the results of the Operation Freedom were these renewed attacks on the UAE, which really haven't really been any since the ceasefire went into effect about a month ago. And actually just on May 2nd, the UAE said that they had fully reopened their airspace. So their airspace was completely closed at the beginning of the war. And they were the first to kind of start to open and gradually reopen, and it had continued to gradually reopen until being fully opened by May 2nd. But then basically the day later, there were these renewed attacks, and now it's closed till May 11th. So operationally, that's going to be a disruption for the UAE, and we know Emirates, Etihad are major carriers that have their bases there. So that will have operational impacts. At the same time, we've seen kind of a reshuffling and a gradual shifting of capacity to follow the demand shift and the volume shifts because the Middle East was basically less accessible. So this will certainly be a setback, but overall what we're seeing is more capacity being moved to other routes to go from Asia really to Europe instead of going through the Middle East. And because of that, and because of some of the capacity recovery out of the Middle East itself, we've seen rates kind of stabilize. So rates increased sharply to start the war. And on some lanes, they've continued to increase, but the rate of increase has stopped. And on some lanes, they've kind of evened out, and others, they even cooled a little bit. So if we look at the overall rate behavior, our Freightos Air Index global benchmark, it's 25% higher than it was before the war. That's significant, but it's 5% lower than it was a month ago. So if we look at kind of specific examples, Southeast Asia to Europe, those rates ticked back up a little bit this week, but they're about level with where they were when they reached their high in April. So they kind of went to a high and now are still at that level, not continuing to climb. South Asia to Europe prices are down 10% from their high, which was a few weeks ago. Southeast Asia and North America prices are down 9% from their peak. But again, quite elevated, more than $6.40 per kilo. If we look at lanes into the Middle East, though, those are facing more cost price pressure by comparison. And maybe this closure just this week will, worsen that. So we have North America to Middle East prices. They were up 6% this week. Europe to Middle East were up only 2%, but they're about at its peak level, which is almost $3.90 per kilo. And some of this difference between kind of upward pressure on rates to the Middle East compared to the others is a little bit counterintuitive because we know that capacity is rebounding. But it's possible that as capacity is rebounding, we're also seeing a big increase in demand because volumes that normally go through that way because it's the most efficient route for them is not coming back. So that's probably what's happening there. So overall, we're seeing kind of a stabilization, but certainly rates that are still quite elevated.
All right. Wow. Okay. Thank you for that, Judah. Super interesting updates this week. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you again next week. Have a great day.